The reading today is from Exodus chapter 34, verses 5 and 6, and Psalm 145, verses 3 to 9. Then the Lord came down in the cloud and stood there with him and proclaimed his name, the Lord. And he passed in front of Moses, proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. Great is the Lord and most worthy of praise. His greatness no one can fathom. One generation commends your works to another. They tell of your mighty acts. They speak of the glorious splendor of your majesty, and I will meditate on your wonderful works. They celebrate your abundant goodness and joyfully sing of your righteousness. The Lord is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger and rich in love. The Lord is good to all. He has compassion on all he has made. This is the word of the Lord.
Thank you, Naomi, and good morning. It's good to see you. And I'm just going to jump straight in. Tom kicked off our new series last week, God of the Ages, introducing these verses from Exodus 34 and the importance really of what we think about when we think about God. Do check it out if you weren't able to make it. Brilliant talk, really helpful introduction, and an invitation into more through the words in this passage of Exodus 34, which are kind of a self-description list from God, which the scriptures circle back to again and again. One example there, as we just saw in the Psalms. Words to take in and to meditate on and to explore together more of the mystery of God this year. And we're going to get straight into the list. Top of that list, the kind of self-description from God. There's this pairing really in the way that it's written. The Lord, the compassionate and gracious God. Compassionate and gracious, which go together, work with each other. And we'll start this morning on the theme of compassion. I wonder what you think of when you hear the word compassion. As you might imagine, it's an incredibly rich word. And as we start now to put together some of the kind of visceral imagery that comes with it, my hope is that it's helpful for us in gaining a fresh insight and wonder into the nature, the character, what we think about when we think about God. The word we use comes from the Latin, which is two words put together, which literally means to suffer with. Entering into places of pain and brokenness, to go where it hurts. And similarly, even in modern research now, Brené Brown puts it succinctly, nicely, when she talks about compassion as a practice based in the beauty and pain of shared humanity. A practice based in the beauty and pain of shared humanity. You could frame it something like this, if it's helpful, where sympathy is feeling for someone, perhaps a little bit more in thought. Empathy has more of that connection, more of a feeling within, and it helps us to understand what someone is experiencing and reflect back, which is a really powerful tool then of compassion. Compassion, more taking action in the face of suffering, that I am here with you. Sympathy may look in, but compassion goes in. And reading the New Testament really helps with this, as well as this amazing word, splanchnizomai. One of my favorite words, splanchnizomai. And it comes from the word for entrails, like inner organs in the Greek of the New Testament. So it's like being so moved to something that you feel it in your insides, gut-wrenching. It's a term we use, isn't it? And we're moved to action. It's the word used in the parable of the prodigal son. You may know it. While he was still a long way off, the father saw him and was filled with compassion, filled with splanchnizomai, and ran and embraced him, something you would never do in that context. That's who God is, a God of compassion. And then in the original Hebrew that our Exodus text, it was written in, the word rahum comes actually from the word for womb. So again, powerful intimate language, quite intense, something that resonates deep within, the intimate means of sustaining and fostering life, a part that hurts. I read that as kind of divine tenderness and fierce life within. And as Tom hinted at last week, that's why this language helps us think about God's compassion as the way a parent feels towards a child. Lots of our own examples of this will have been tarnished and muddied and doesn't quite land. I know that from my own parenting flaws as well. But even if it's just a tiny glimpse of an expression of it, I think it's still a meaningful comparison. You're seeing Liz grow and nourish and hold and care for our kids, celebrating first steps like it's an Olympic gold, those kind of endless crayon drawings like they're kind of peak Monet, and this just desire to, want nothing more than to see them thrive and to see them fly. How much more then with the compassionate God? Not compassionate in theory, but in very name and very being and action. God of the ages, past, present, and future. In other words, if God is compassionate, he's compassionate all of the time. The Psalms talk about God being full of compassion. As we heard in Psalm 145, that God has compassion on all that he has made. All that he has made, in other words, everything, everyone. And so even from this brief word study, when the list starts with the compassionate God in Exodus 34, already can we be thinking about this depth of language of the womb, of motherly love, of feeling something so powerfully that it resonates with your insides and moves you to action, moves you to participate and suffer with, and we start to get a bit of a picture of what it is that God's talking about. Does that make sense? Is that helpful? It's how God feels about you. And as Tom said so well last week, we see that most clearly in Jesus, the embodiment of God's compassion in the flesh, born from the fragility and vulnerability of a human womb. And in his life, death, and resurrection, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God on display. Do you know God's compassion for you? And does it have anything to do with how we live today anyway? Well, I'd love to just finish the talk there, to be honest with you. But we get this incredibly inconvenient line from Jesus in Luke 6:36, where he says, "Be compassionate, just as your Father is compassionate." It says in the NLT, merciful is another word that's used. Be compassionate as your Father is compassionate. Now, there are a number of studies I was reading suggesting that empathy and compassion are very much in decline. And one in the UK I found actually quite entertaining. The study basically found that the vast majority of people described themselves as compassionate, but the vast majority of people also described other people as selfish. 74%, 77%, something like that. So in other words, the problem is with you. I'm compassionate. That's one of my core values. But other people, everyone else, absolutely selfish. And so, how we need living signs of God's compassionate presence in the world today. All that's going on. The free and joyful expression, overflow of encounter with the compassionate and gracious God. And those of you who are here, if you remember the Story to Live In series from about this time last year, this call that we have as the church to be image bearers, joining God's purposes to make all things new, people of a future hope, living it out in the present. And the beautiful thing is that future has already begun and is revealed each time we show compassion. Each time people are welcomed. Each time those in need are clothed or the bullied are reminded of their worth. The kingdom of God is at hand when children experiencing abuse are set free, when oppression is overcome. That future is already in our midst. Like Tom said, maybe sometimes we get caught up with this picture of God kind of waiting for us to slip up or wanting to point the finger. But actually, it's that the compassionate God is restoring and healing and making all things new. And it's like, would you like to be a part of that? So how do we be a part of that? And just to say, this doesn't come particularly naturally to me. Sometimes find this challenging, and I'm preaching to myself at this point. You're welcome to keep listening in if you want, but just to say I'm preaching to myself. But I want to offer this simple model and suggest that what gives compassion kind of texture, shape, substance is a flow of prayer and action. And it's like this because one fuels the other and compels the other. It's dynamic. Prayer and putting it into practice. Other words that we've used could, with these, like combination of formation and mission, contemplation and action. We've even heard it this morning, kind of deep wells, roaring fires, some of that language. And priest and theologian Henri Nouwen draws the connection between these two so well when he writes this. If prayer leads us into a deeper unity with the compassionate Christ, it will always give rise to concrete acts of service. And if concrete acts of service do indeed lead us to deeper solidarity with the poor, the hungry, the sick, the dying and the oppressed, they will always give rise to prayer. We see this flow of prayer and practice in Jesus, don't we? Kind of finding the quiet place, the secret place again and again, but also the action. And interesting in the Gospels, like whenever it talks about Jesus having compassion, it's pretty much always a precursor then to something happening, to forgiveness or to healing, to action. So that being moved to compassion and being moved to action are inseparable. And that Henri Nouwen quote continues with this kind of mic drop moment. In prayer, we meet Christ, and in him, all human suffering. And in service, we meet people, and in them, the suffering Christ. He's saying as we spend time in prayer, we engage with the heart of Jesus, humble, taking the very nature of a servant, no stranger to suffering, the one that says, "Come to me, all you who are heavy, burdened." And then in loving and serving and showing compassion practically in the world, we find Jesus present there. Think of his words, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did for the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." And it's the presence that is key to all of this. Not in our own strength, but through the Spirit at work in our lives. We say, just as Moses said in the chapter before our Exodus passage, like, if your presence does not go with us, don't send us up from here. We can say that as well. If your presence is not with us, then it's not really worth it. And compassion then becomes a gift, an overflow, as well as a choice. It's the fruit of God's grace made real by the Spirit, outworked in our lives, in community, together, pointing to God's compassion then in a world in need. It's this flow of prayer and practice centered on the presence of God, the Trinity, and we're invited into that. That's the amazing thing. We're invited in, awoken to what's possible then in our lives. Prayer and action working together. I think I might have shared this one before, but when I often think about that, there was this one time a while ago, I was with a small team in China, and what we would kind of do, we'd gather together in the morning, pray, and then if there was a sense of something, we'd kind of try and act on it, the prayer and practice. And this one time, one of the team had this sense of that God was kind of saying, prompting us to go to the high places. And weren't quite sure what that means, but we just thought, let's just take it. Literally, we'll find the highest place in the area, go there and sin. So we went to the top of there was this mountain in the place where we were staying. We went to the top of this mountain, trekked to the top, and we had this, it was kind of that amazing, when you get somewhere and there's just this amazing vista, this amazing view looking over the city. And we had this kind of a wonderful time of praying for the city, praying for all that was going on, all felt quite good about ourselves. And then we went to head down. And on the way back, we basically just got completely lost, kind of going around in circles. Mandarin wasn't particularly up to scratch to ask for directions. And then all of a sudden, we're kind of meandering. We hear this faint singing. And it was like, that sounds, was there was a little hallelujah in there or something? Maybe it was the same 4 chords that we use for our songs. That's a joke, Tom. A-star in music. I remembered that one from last week. And then basically what happened was we effectively bumped into this illegal secret house church meeting on the side of a mountain. And through kind of broken language and charades, we were able to just spend this really short, special time with them, just sharing and encouraging and praying. Amazing little moment. And then afterwards, guess what? We found our way absolutely fine back down the mountain. It was just this special moment. And as I kind of think about this flow of prayer and practice of things going together, it reminds me that actually it's God that's at work. It's God that's doing things, and we get to participate in that. And so we've looked at the compassion of God, our calling to compassion that we can participate in through prayer and practice rooted in the presence. And to kind of start to bring this into land, I really want to ground this in kind of our real life as much as possible. And so I just want to share 2 really brief ways that I see this as interacting with our everyday lives. And that's that the compassionate life affects our relationship with time, and it reflects our relationship with each other, with other people. Time and others, our relationship with time. We as humanity, I think, have been trying to figure out the constraints of time and how to work with time, from kind of sundials to Siri, how to maximize, seeing it as like kind of a squeezed commodity. We have phrases like not enough hours in the day, don't we? Time is money. And I was reading in some monastic settings, there's this bell that rings to signify when it's time to move on to the next thing that people there are doing, the next task for the monks or the nuns there. And it's not necessarily because they feel like it or because they're ready to move on to the next thing, but because it's time. Not because they don't have clocks or the ability to prioritize, but into their rhythms is built this reminder that time is not actually their own. Apparently, St. Benedict even had this line about putting down the pen before even dotting the I's and crossing the T's when the bell goes. That's obviously a very different setting to most of us. But then I was thinking, I'm sure we have our own versions of those interruptions, of the bell going, of reminders that time isn't ours to hoard. Maybe it's the train that's delayed, or the tricky colleague that needs our help when we're in the middle of something, the older parent that needs caring for, or the toddler at your ankles. When we think about compassion, what if the interruptions are actually the moments? What if the mundane is sometimes the main event? What if every moment is a gift in which to be fully present? And as we are, our patience grows and our delight in those moments grows in step with the Spirit. And New on me now and again talks about patience. Talks about patience as the main discipline of compassion, which is really interesting. Again, comes from that same root to suffer in the Latin. Obviously, we want to steward time well. Obviously, we want to get things done. Obviously, there's some helpful ways of doing things. But when we're hurried with back-to-back time slot restrictions moving us from one event to the next, to extend compassion is sometimes to interrupt and to enable others to take part in the fullness of God's timing. And then, so it's time, but it also impacts our relationship with other people. Judy Canato, an author and spiritual director, has this beautiful line that says, "Compassion pulls us out of ourselves and into the heart of another, placing us on holy ground where we instinctively take our shoes off and walk in reverence." Isn't that beautiful language of seeing God's image in the other people? We instinctively take our shoes off, walk in reverence, spending time with other people. And so often life is marked with, I don't know about you, that kind of sense of competition, or pitted against one another, or this group or that group, or othering. It's kind of the way our society functions. But as we've seen, compassion then moves us to action, to go where it hurts, to go in and see the divine image in everyone, as well as to know it for ourselves. And we can't really do that without proximity, without being close, being near to, getting to know, gradually taking down some of these competitive barriers. And we learn things we wouldn't otherwise know. We grow in ways we wouldn't otherwise grow when we have proximity. As an example, I was thinking of, I used to work for an organization supporting the persecuted church. And I could tell some stories, I could reel off the stats, it was helpful. I knew these things, but it wasn't until I sat down and had lunch with these people, looked into their eyes and heard their stories. This is one example of a lady from North Korea, over 70 years old, 5 foot tall, but like an absolute giant of her faith. And to hear her story of losing her husband, of being in a concentration camp for years, of facing the most inhumane things you can imagine of. I was having lunch with her in a pub, and the meals came with a corn on the cob on her plate, and she basically asked me if I wouldn't mind having her corn on the cob, because for so many years, all she was eating was this kind of form of corn, only food she had. And it almost took her straight back to some of those experiences. The closeness of her saying, "Can you eat my corn on the cob?" Passing from hand to hand, that's proximity. It's different than just maybe knowing about what's happening. Proximity hits different. And there are opportunities all around. We've heard about teams today. What an amazing way to help serve each other and the wider community. Things like happening like the meeting place. The banquets that they put on is such a beautiful depiction of this compassion I'm talking about, because it's people cooking together and eating together and celebrating together in proximity. And through the organizations that we can give to, in our daily interactions and interruptions, in our relationship with time, as I've been saying, we can offer this renewed perspective through patience and proximity. Yes, it's good to have some healthy boundaries, of course. It's probably a different talk. We'll have different capacities at different times of our lives. I know that. But I really think this is important. I'd go as far to say that we would only know God so deeply if we're somewhat removed from other people's suffering. It's the image we get at the top of the list of this compassionate God that we then follow. And just to land, this came to life for me again this week, actually. I was watching the movie Just Mercy. I don't know if anyone's seen it, Just Mercy. And it just almost like, as I was thinking through these themes of compassion for this talk, it just leapt out of me. It's based on the memoir of someone called Brian Stevenson, who is a lawyer and social justice activist. And having graduated from Harvard, whilst on a work placement after university, he experienced the experiences of prison inmates on death row in Alabama. And more so the lack of representation, the wrongful convictions, some sentenced for crimes they had not done. And as he learned about this and he had that proximity, meeting these people, he knew that something had to be done. He's given his life. Amazing man, inspired by faith, worked tirelessly and still does through something called the Equal Justice Initiative. And a couple of lines that, as I say, just really grabbed me, kind of helped bring this to life for me. The first is, there's a moment where he's chatting to his colleague, Eva, who he has worked with, and they've just had a big setback in a case. And she says this: "I've heard a lot of people say it's not a good idea to get close to your clients. The distance is healthy. But working with you showed me that's not true. You chose to get close to every one of them. You love them like they are your family. And when your family is hurting, you are hurting. And then in a speech that Brian Stevenson makes, he says this: I came out of law school with grand ideas in my mind about how to change the world. But Mr. Macmillan, who's one of the first cases that he takes on, made me realize we can't change the world with only ideas in our minds. We need conviction in our hearts. This man taught me how to stay hopeful because I now know that hopelessness is the enemy of justice. Through this work, I've learned that each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done. The character of our nation isn't reflected in how we treat the rich and the privileged, but how we treat the poor, the disfavored, and the condemned. If we can look at ourselves closely and honestly, he says, perhaps we all need some measure of unmerited grace. Unmerited grace from a God at the top of whose self-description list is compassion. Compassion that nurtures and nourishes and protects, that resonates and reverberates inside, moving us to action and to solidarity. And the invitation for us then is to participate through this flow of prayer and practice with patience and proximity as the natural then overflow, fueled and sustained in it all by the presence of the Lord, the compassionate God. The compassionate God who is making all things new. Amen? Amen. Why don't we stand together?